My name is David Birdsell. I am Dean of the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. Welcome to the school, welcome to the college, and welcome to this first Marxe Issues Forum for 2018. We have a wonderful panel with us today and a very important guest, Ambassador Michael Froman. Let me take a moment to introduce them, but first let me take just a couple of seconds to talk about how we're going to run the program this morning. We'll begin with remarks from Ambassador Froman talking about what he sees as key issues right now in trade policy and the linkages between trade policy and national security. We're then going to move into a conversation that will involve Professor Robbins and Professor Muhleisen as well, talking about aspects of what Ambassador Froman overviewed at the top and some other things that he may or may not have been able to get to during that period of time. We'll run that conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to go to questions from you. And the way that those will be managed, you will have, in fact, they should already be there, I think, index cards where you can write questions. Those will be then sent up to me. I will do my best to amalgamate questions that are in parallel with one another so that we can get as much coverage as possible before we wrap up at about 10 minutes to the hour, or roughly an hour and a quarter from now. So that's where we're going to go. Let me just take a couple of seconds. You have biographies in front of you to introduce our panelists today. I'm going to start at the far end with Joselyn Muhleisen, who is a lecturer in public and international affairs, recently completed her doctorate focusing on trade policy at the Keeney Graduate Center in Political Science. Next to her is Carla Robbins. Professor Robbins is an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and most important to us, a clinical professor and faculty director of the Master of International Affairs. And our guest of honor today is Ambassador Michael Froman. He has had a distinguished career in public service, culminating in a period as U.S. Trade Representative in the second Obama administration, 2013, through the final day of that administration last year in January. He is currently at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. So what I'd like to do is, yes, applause. It's a good thing. So what I'd like to do is ask the ambassador to give us an overview of what you see happening right now. Life looks a little bit different from the way it did when you stepped out of service in 2017.
Just a little.
And give us a sense of what the burning issues are today, and if you could explain a little bit about the vital link between our trade policy and our national security.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. Carla and Mitch have been talking about Rook and Marxe for some time with me, so it's a great pleasure to be up here. I have to admit it's my first time on your campus, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm also delighted that I'm very thankful to President Trump for keeping trade on the front burner. He is certainly in high demand these days, issues of trade policy. And in fact, I think our number one export right now is political entertainment. The rest of the world is quite eagerly following everything going on here. As you travel abroad, everybody wants to try and understand what's going on here, and so are we. So it's a bit of a challenge. I thought what I'd do is just take literally 5 minutes perhaps and give a bit of a framework of how one might think about trade. And I think one should look at trade really in three ways: economics, geoeconomics, and geopolitics or national security. And really in that order of priority, because when we enter into trade agreements, I think first and foremost, they have to be justified on their economic merits, what they do for jobs, wages, economic activity here in the United States. If you enter into a trade agreement, that's got to be first and foremost on your agenda. I think the interesting thing with going on now is that while we've seen a rise of populism, not just in the United States, but in the UK, around Brexit, on the continent of Europe, in some of the rise of particularly right-wing populism, which has begun to combine with left-wing populism, it hasn't all been anti-trade. I think what's going on in the United States actually is quite a bit different from what's going on elsewhere. Those in the UK who were in favor of Brexit, the day after their referendum passed, went out and said, now we have to go out and negotiate better, more open, more liberal trade agreements. it was not anti-trade, it was not anti-globalization. It was a view, in fact, that Britain could play a bigger role on the international stage if they weren't shackled by the European Commission. And what we see in continental Europe is still very much, while the right and the left have risen a bit, it's really the center is holding, and more of a commitment now to globalization and integration, perhaps, than we've seen for some time. Here, of course, it's a bit different, and I think President Trump was able to tap into a sense of economic insecurity and a concern about wages and jobs, quite legitimate concern, by the way, about wage stagnation, about income inequality, in ways that were channeled into the trade area. Whether trade had anything to do with it is another issue, or how much trade had to do with it is another issue, whether it's technology, whether it's immigration, whether it's trade. But trade is what becomes oftentimes the scapegoat or the vessel into which people pour their legitimate economic issues. On the economic side, I think what's interesting is the rest of the world continues to move on. The European Union is negotiating trade agreements around the world. The TPP countries, Trans-Pacific Partnership countries, have decided to move on with TPP without the United States. There's very interesting trade integration going on in Latin America with the Pacific Alliance. In Africa, there's active negotiations going on of various trade agreements amongst themselves and across the continent. And so it's really the U.S. that is a bit of an outlier here, while the rest of the world continues to see the value. And why that's important is as the rest of the world moves on, it's our businesses, our workers, our farmers and ranchers who will see their share of the global marketplace go down. So if we're on the sidelines while the rest of the world moves forward, we'll actually see a decline of opportunity rather than an increase. Second issue, geoeconomics. And this I think is actually quite important. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was an effort to integrate 40% of the global economy, but it was very consciously an effort to say, we think it's important that the U.S. play a leadership role in writing the rules of the road for the global trading system, as we have, by the way, for much of the last 70 years, and not give up that role to China or to anybody else, because China, to be frank, has a very different view of how the rules-based system or how the global trading system should operate. All you need to do is look at their recent conference on internet governance and talk about the Great Firewall of China versus our approach in TPP around the free flow of information across borders and making sure that data could flow wherever it needs to flow. So the geoeconomics of agreements like TPP it's awfully important. It's who gets to write the rules of the road, and do those rules support an open trading system, or do they support more protectionism or more localization? And then the third area that the dean alluded to is really the national security area and the link between trade and national security. And those linkages, I think, are both obvious and underappreciated. All one needs to do is look at Europe and the European Union, and with all of its problems and all of its stumbles, what a tremendous success the European Union is as a reflection of how trade and integration have brought enemies of several hundred years together in ways that it seems inconceivable that they could go back to conflict. Trade creates habits of cooperation. It has spillover effects into politics and national security. Just look at NAFTA. Some of us are old enough to remember what Mexico was like before NAFTA, or how much concern there was about the fragility of Mexico before NAFTA. Which direction would it go in? Would it stay stable? And Mexico continues to be a country with tremendous problems, whether it's organized crime or corruption or guns or drugs. But it is fundamentally more stable as part of a larger North American unit and has put its fate into a North American framework in a way that was not obvious 30 years ago, and really is a very substantial step towards securing North America in a way that may not have been possible. And again, just to look back to Asia for a moment, we were talking about this a little bit before, during breakfast. Our partners in the region, Vietnam, Vietnam desperately wants the U.S. to be engaged in Asia, economically, politically, strategically. They want us there, not as a way of containing China, because I don't think China is capable of being contained per se, but to balance and to have an alternative model, an alternative partnership, to avoid being overly dependent on one country for either economic well-being or for national security. And that's where trade plays a significant role, because through trade, we find ourselves meeting, engaging, beginning to solve other problems, and as it grows, we end up having a deeper and deeper national security relationship as well. All of those things are very much open to question right now. We have NAFTA being renegotiated, we have TPP being withdrawn from, we have a rather tense and somewhat uncertain relationship with Europe. We can talk about that, I'm sure, in the questions. But as we think about what is an appropriate way of dealing with trade going forward, I'd recommend thinking about both all the economics, the geoeconomics, and the national security elements together.
Thank you for that elegant overview. Let me take the first part of that, if I may, and go back to this question about populism and its relationship to what government leadership is able to do with regard to trade and empowered, arguably, in this administration. Have we developed a language that can effectively frame trade issues for democratic publics? I'm thinking particularly of the United States, but I'd also like to place that in the broader context of European democracy. You made the point about some of the Brexit, particularly the Brexit leadership, making the argument that Britain can be more effective on the global stage without Europe. But that wasn't necessarily how it was playing on the street in Manchester. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the language that we use to speak to people in a democracy about the importance of trade, whether it's a linkage to security or trade qua trade.
This is it's a great question. And I think first we have to start from perhaps a factual basis. Most economists will tell us that 80% of the impact that we see on wages or jobs in a rapidly changing economy comes from technology. Certainly globalization plays somewhat of a role, but it's a relatively minor role compared to technology. And by the way, we only need to look at the United States. We are manufacturing more product here in the United States now than we ever have in our history. For people who say we don't produce things, or we don't manufacture things in this country, that's just completely wrong. We're doing it with fewer workers, substantially fewer workers than we have in the past, and that's largely because of automation in the workplace. And if you look at all major industrialized countries, including Germany, which is often held up as the great manufacturing export-oriented model, they've all seen almost identical decline in number of workers, percentage of workers in the manufacturing sector as the sector has grown more mature. But we don't get to vote on technology. You don't get to vote on software. You don't get to vote on robots. You don't really get to vote on globalization. Globalization is a fact of life. You know, it's the reflection of the containerization of shipping, or the spread of broadband around the world, which have allowed services to be provided from wherever they might be provided from. You do get to vote on trade policy. And so trade policy becomes this target and the scapegoat. And it's very difficult to fight against all the very legitimate concerns that people have in defending trade policy, because it's quite an esoteric and archaic area. And we have not done a particularly good job of it. We tend to advocate for trade policy by talking about statistics. And when you hold up statistics versus fear, fear almost always wins. And everybody knows a factory that has closed down and moved to China or to Mexico in the last 20 years. Everyone knows somebody who's lost a job because of international competition or because of automation. And so that fear is always there, and we've not been able to appeal on the same emotional level as to trade. You know, we can make iPhones in this country entirely. We don't need trade to make iPhones, but they'll cost $3,000. And they'll be out of the reach of the single mother who uses them when she's running between jobs to FaceTime with her kids at home. You know, she is dependent on trade. Her kids are dependent on trade. Her ability to provide clothing and back to school goods on a relatively modest budget is completely dependent on trade. Our ability to feed our families at relatively low cost, or to have the array of goods on the table that we have, is completely dependent on trade. You know, I remember growing up, we didn't have grapes 12 months a year. You had seasonal fruit, right? You had seasonal vegetables. Well, that's the reason we have grapes 12 months a year is because of trade policy. Because now we get them from Chile or we get them from Peru. Our whole, it's been estimated that trade agreements have contributed about $14,000 to the average American family's income, when you take into account all the reduction in tariffs as a consumer. What's harder to make the argument for in ways that people can appreciate is how it's contributed to them as producers, as workers, that it's helped them move towards higher paying jobs or more productive jobs. And that's what people worry about. All hope is not lost. If you look at recent polls, and the Pew Foundation has done a lot of work on this, first of all, more people are internationalists and support trade now than I think for the last several decades. More than 70% of the American public support trade. But for the first time, and for a long time, they've supported trade as a matter of consumers. They recognize that as consumers, they're benefiting from it. For the first time, 56% of the American public believes that trade creates jobs and improves wages in the United States. And so I do think people are beginning to understand more, perhaps when we see what's at risk with protectionism, exactly what's at stake in the global trading system. We have to do a much better job of making it real for people, not just the macro arguments, not just the statistics, but things that they can relate to in their day-to-day life and that they can relate to on an emotional basis.
You mentioned TPP as a lost opportunity in many respects. Can you talk a little bit about what the damage may be to the United States in not being an initial partner in TPP? And as you pointed out, it's moving along just without us. Can we get back in? And with regard to trade relationships overall, this administration is prioritizing bilateral trade relationships, not the multi-party trade relationships that had been the emphasis in several prior administrations. How much ground do we lose? Is it possible simply to say, okay, we're going back into this game if its subsequent administration were to decide to go in a different direction?
I have no doubt that the decision to withdraw from TPP will be seen in retrospect as one of the greatest strategic blunders in recent American history. I think it's already playing out, unfortunately, exactly as we feared it would play out. That's the bad news. I think the good news is, and somewhat to my surprise, the fact that the TPP 11, the other 11 countries, have decided to move forward with TPP without us, I think is a positive, because we'll see most of the rules that we negotiated, whether it's on strengthening labor and environmental protections, or putting disciplines on state-owned enterprises so that they have to compete fairly with private firms, or the digital economy issues around the free flow of data across borders. We'll see those go into effect, and that is very much in our interest. And it's in our interest, when it comes to rules, it's in our interest that as many countries adopt as consistent a set of rules as possible. That's why the Obama administration and previous administrations put value in multi-party negotiations. Because particularly if you're a small business, if you're GE, if you're a big business, you have a staff of 100 people who are understanding trade agreements and figuring out how to navigate them and make sure that your policies are, or your products are sort of aligned with the benefits of the trade agreements. If you're a small business, you can't afford to do that. You can't afford to navigate multiple rules into multiple markets. And so having one consistent set of rules across as much of the global economy as possible is of great value for bringing small and medium-sized businesses, which are the job creators in most economies, into the global trading system. So that's why there's emphasis there. The fact that the 11 have gone forward, I think, is a positive thing. And they, by the way, they very much have kept the door open to the United States eventually coming back. And there's a process for that to happen. And we will have lost some of our leverage in that process, because we had negotiated a lot of leverage in terms of being able to make sure other countries fully implemented their obligations before it went into effect. But I hope at some point the U.S. The U.S. does return. What we will see is a challenge to our market share as the TPP 11 moves forward, as the EU moves forward with its agreement with Canada and with Japan, and now it's trying to complete one with Mexico and Australia and New Zealand. I'll just use one example. We're a major beef producer to the world. So is Australia. And I am fully prepared to believe that our beef is better than Australian beef. But when you face the Japanese market, we have an Australian cattleman here? All right. But when you face the Japanese market, we now face somewhere between a 39 and a 50% tariff on our beef. And the Australians face about a 29% tariff on their beef, and it's going down to 19%. We have a hard time competing with that. The cattlemen in the United States have estimated that they're losing about $140 million a year of sales just because of that one agreement between Australia and Japan. Multiply that by 1,000 products and a dozen countries, and you'll see that group after group in the United States, agriculture and manufacturing services, are going to find ourselves on the outside looking in as our market share is being challenged by our competitors elsewhere, whether it's Europe or across the TPP countries. And that is very much an economic negative, which is why more and more groups are now speaking out in favor of returning to TPP. 25 senators wrote a letter last week, about that. Various agricultural groups are feeling the pain already, and they've come out. I think you'll see that more and more across the U.S. economy as these other initiatives move forward.
Well, don't worry, in Baruch Catering Systems, it's only American beef that you guys serve across. Sorry, John. We'll work this out another time. I have one more question for you before I get Carla and Joselyn into the conversation as well. And it has to do with this idea of a common set of rules. One of the arguments that the president made during his campaign was that the United States is getting taken to the cleaners by China, particularly. The newly issued National Defense Strategy calls China out specifically as a security issue, as a trade manipulator. And there are very strident positions taken in that document with regard to China particularly. Is that the right way to proceed? And is he right? Is it possible that we can get a better deal, even within the context of the current WTO-driven process, by being a more aggressive player within that framework?
You know, I think this administration is right to focus on the particular challenge that China poses to the global trading system. And the WTO is not as well suited as we would like to deal with state capitalism and predatory industrial policy and the kind of policies that China's been now quite open about talking about it. The China 2025 strategy, the China 2050 aspirations, whether it's subsidizing, maintaining a closed market to protect various industries, forced technology transfer, intellectual property rights theft, whatever it is, all the various tools that China brings to the table, they do very much pose a challenge to the open rules-based trading system. The question is what to do about it. And I don't think any of us have fully cracked the code on this. I think we made some progress during the Obama administration, particularly on intellectual property rights, on some of the what was called indigenous innovation policies of the Chinese. But by no means did we completely solve the problem, and there certainly is work to be done. The approach there's been a lot of rhetoric during the campaign about China. Then there was a fair amount of bromance over the first year, whether it was Mar-a-Lago or the state visit that was the best, greatest visit of any foreigner to China in the history of the continent, whatever it was. Now there's there's the beginning of some trade actions under our various trade remedy laws, and we'll see how those proceed. We've certainly gotten the attention of China, but China's feeling pretty good right now. They had a good year last year. President Xi went to Davos, announced that China was the leader of the free trade system with a straight face, and notwithstanding their policies. They had their One Belt, One Road initiative, really quite a remarkable strategic initiative with more than 30 heads of state coming and a lot of money being put into infrastructure, and not just infrastructure. They view this as a key part of the global governance architecture going forward that could spill over into other areas. They had the Party Congress where President Xi's thoughts were written into the Constitution, and they were laid out their visions for the future. And they're no longer the focus of global attention in terms of being the most protectionist threat to the global trading system. We are. So they're at the G20 with the majority of countries critical of the United States rather than the G20 surrounding China and being critical of its policy. So they've had a very good year. And the question, and they have a regional strategy. We were talking about South China Sea earlier. They're executing on their regional strategy. RCEP, which is their trade agreement like TPP, the Asian Infrastructure Bank. The question is what we can do about it. And whether these unilateral actions fundamentally change China, which I think would be interesting to see, or whether through aggressive use of diplomacy we could build more of a global coalition with the Europeans, the Japanese, the Canadians, the Brazilians, the Indians, the Indonesians, and put more pressure on China on these kinds of policies. My personal view is that latter tends to be more effective. Actually, I think you're only effective changing Chinese policy when you find some constituency within China that is also advocating for that policy. You know, we were successful in some ways on intellectual property because you finally had a group of Chinese entrepreneurs, software entrepreneurs and others, who were creating intellectual property. And they began to care about enforcement. And so if you can combine outside pressure with inside pressure, I think you can be effective. There are forces in China who want to see reform. We need to find ways of working with them, bolstering them, and providing international support for them to move that country in that direction. I'm not sure stirring up the nationalistic pressures through our unilateral action is going to achieve the same objective.
Thank you. Carla, I know you've been focused on the new IDS, and you've been struck by the quality of language with regard to trade in that document. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that as a pivot and what it portends for the United States and our trade partners with regard to the South China Sea and beyond?
So they've come out with these two documents. One is the National Security Strategy and one is the National Defense Strategy, which are congressionally mandated. And basically what they say is what Trump has been saying all along, which is we are getting ripped off by the world, and that it's a world of great power competition, economically, militarily. When they rolled out the National Defense Strategy, they said the fight against terrorism is no longer the focus. It's now all about great power competition. In the near term, yes, the Russians are very problematic in Europe, but in the longer term, the Chinese are trying to supplant us. They're trying to supplant us economically. They're trying to supplant us militarily. Some of these things are not unreasonable statements. Some of these things we certainly have to focus on. But what is missing in all of this, and it really does go back to what Mike was saying, is that you can't take on these fights alone. And by pulling out of TPP, by pulling out of Paris, by threatening to pull out of NAFTA, they have created such a fundamental anxiety about the reliability of the United States which is completely missing in this. They talk about American leadership. They do talk about fighting with allies in these documents as well. And they've completely lost the thread. I don't know if they realize it or not, that people feel that they can't trust us anymore, that they can't rely on us anymore. They talk about North Korea and Iran in it. How can you possibly talk about confronting these people, going to other allies and say, trust us on the intel, when you're not even sure they're going to stand up for the Article 5 commitments, the one for all for one commitments in NATO. So they have described a world of competition in the South China Sea, a world of competition on trade, a world of great power competition that really is a Cold War level of mortal competition, but a world in which those competitions before, in which U.S. leadership was not only taken for granted, but venerated, in which people felt that we were the center of the global trading system, we were the center of the world defense system. Now, President Trump goes out there and says, of course it's America first, we all expect you to put your countries first. and don't really rely on us. And so there's this fundamental contradiction there that is created, I find, everywhere that I go, whether it's talking to the Vietnamese when they were here, going to Halifax, going to the International Security Forum. The fundamental question that people keep saying to me again and again and again is, we're not sure we can really rely on the United States. So you have this document declaring a new Cold War almost, but a United States that is basically withdrawing at the same time. So it seems like a fundamental contradiction to me.
Joselyn, one of those areas of conflict was the president's team called out specifically was Russia and the efforts to influence and to degrade the NATO alliance and the European Union overall. We haven't talked about TTIP. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see as U.S. relationships with regard to trade and ultimately with regard to security on the European continent.
So unfortunately, our European partners are also extremely concerned about the reliability of U.S. commitments, as Carla has noted. TTIP is, a great opportunity for the United States and for the European Union to really, as Michael has noted, set the rules of the game moving forward. And unfortunately, without the completion of TTIP, the EU may eventually become a competitor to the United States in setting regulation. So if the United States abdicates its role as a leader in setting the rules for the global trade system, you have a few options left. So Carla's right, the national security policy being set to sort of see these competitors is one thing, but if you then abdicate your role completely in the system, others will step in, including the European Union. Not all is lost. EU standards are a lot closer to US standards than those perhaps of other places, but harmonizing those standards would certainly move us forward and offer a lot of opportunities to Americans. I also want to connect it to regulatory policy. So there's a great opportunity to set regulatory policy in an agreement like TTIP or TPP, and I don't think politicians or policymakers communicate the benefits of harmonizing regulatory standards very well to the public. It's not necessarily quantifiable off the bat. What does it mean if there's a minimum wage set by TPP? If we have a regulatory council or an ISDS within TTIP, what does it do for us? And the answer is a lot, but I don't know how you communicate that effectively to populations.
So we're back to the difficulty of trying to explain inherently complicated things to people who aren't involved with it on a daily basis. Taking trade down from the national level and the relationships between nations to relationships to subsidiary components of nations. And I'm thinking of state to province trade activity, city to city trade activity, an explicit policy of the Obama administration out of the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs and the Department of Commerce over both Obama terms. Any of the three of you, but starting with the ambassador, could you talk a little bit about the rise of subnational trade activity, which has now been embraced by mayors and governors in this country and around the world?
Yeah, no, look, I think it's very important, and I think when we were advocating for TPP, I loved working with governors and mayors because they totally get it. And by the way, on a completely bipartisan basis, the number of Democratic mayors, Democratic governors who are close to the ground, see the job creation possibilities, and are out there, as you suggested, advocating for their cities and their states. They now see it as a core part of their job to have an international trade office, to lead trade missions to countries around the world, to lead investment missions to try and get companies to invest in their states and their localities. And it has a real effect. It has a real effect. And there's a competition going on among them to try and attract that kind of activity. So, when I'm on a plane to Asia, it's 3 out of 4 times there's some governor or mayor, with a delegation on the plane heading over there to try and advocate for them, and it really works. And at a time when the federal government is sort of seen as kind of stepping back. Now, what states and localities can't do is really trade policy. They can't negotiate trade agreements with other countries or eliminate barriers or things of that sort, because those are largely at the federal level. But what they can do is a very effective job of advocacy. And other countries, Germany, France, Britain, they're very good at advocacy for their companies. We've gotten better at it at the federal level, but I think governors and mayors are really at the leading edge of that.
Is there anything within the current federal environment that either accelerates or hinders that kind of state to province, city to city relationship? Again, an explicit policy of the Obama administration. Where is that today?
Well, one thing that we did in the Obama administration, and this may have started back in Bush, something called Select USA, which was a program to attract investment to the United States. But under the Obama administration, we greatly expanded it. We would have these annual conferences of literally thousands of people, and they would sell out almost immediately. People coming from all over the world, but also a lot of governors and mayors came to present on their cities and states to attract investment to the United States. Again, taking a page out of books that other countries have been doing for some time. We always were kind of complacent about it. Felt like the U.S. is here, we don't really need to promote ourselves. But at a time with global competition, we do need to make the case of why a foreign company should put their incremental dollar of investment in the United States versus someplace else. I haven't seen that continued in this administration, but I imagine that's an area that they would be quite receptive to, because they are working very hard to try and attract economic activity back to the United States, and it's something that can be done at the federal level in terms of encouragement as well.
Oh, and that was the opening argument in Davos, right? The United States is open for business. Come and invest here.
Absolutely.
You know, David, it's interesting when President Trump pulled out of Paris, and then you had Mayor Bloomberg step up and say, and you had governors and mayors all over the country saying, well, you've got the federal government, you've got the president saying he doesn't believe in climate change and we're going to pull back from this. But private businesses and mayors and governors can make up at least half of the difference, even with getting out of the Clean Power Plan. Don't worry, the United States is still committed. And you saw governments all over the world seize onto this. Don't worry, that we can still push forward with this system. And it's true on a certain level, but it's basically what people are holding on to almost with bloody fingernails for 4 years. That don't worry, the United States really hasn't given up, because there's still a United States separate from Donald Trump, separate from the sort of nihilism, the Luddites that are going on in Washington. But when you talk about the really major national security issues, and when you talk about even on the Pew polling data, people are turning against the United States and turning against Americans for the first time as well. That halo effect there of the Bloomberg effort, of the climate change, all of that is comforting for all of us, but it's really the pronouncements out of Washington are really having a very injurious effect on the notion of American leadership. And for the first time, not just on the perception of the U.S. government, but also the perception of the United States. I don't mean to be a downer on this, but it is truly out there and it's measurable.
Well, we can be down. It's
Last time we did this, you accused me of being fizzy.
and well, it's nice to oscillate.
Right.
But let's stay with this for a moment, and a version of a question that I asked earlier. How do we claw back? I mean, this is we are clearly not participating in TPP right now as that agreement moves forward. TTIP, as Joselyn suggests, is somewhere, but we're not exactly sure where. What can be done right now, and again, absent regime change, right? I mean, what is it that we can be working toward right now, and how much ground do we necessarily lose? Is that essentially water under the bridge, it's gone, or can we return to something like the status quo ante at some point, should a different administration elect to go back in that direction? And I'll leave that with, Joselyn, do you want to start?
I think the answer is yes, but only as soon as there's a recommitment to the multilateral system, until multilateral agreements. I think you're going to see us lose ground, as Michael's noted, when we're not a part of these agreements, because U.S. preferences won't be considered in them. And U.S. commitment to the World Trade Organization, and okay, the dispute settlement mechanism is far from perfect, and we all acknowledge that, but not using these institutions when the United States has been a founding member of them, comes at a cost for American participation in the international system and the leverage we can have later on. So I think it's possible. I don't know where we will be in 4 years. I don't think anyone does. But the longer that 3 years, okay. But the longer that we do not participate and really push those multilateral institutions and agreements, we will be losing.
Yeah, there's fundamental anxiety about American leadership is really a major one, and it's a very dangerous one. I am very, last time when we talked about this, you weren't sure that TPP would go forward. You didn't think the Japanese were going to commit to it. And that is very comforting, and because many of the rules for that rules-based system seem to be going forward. That's a good thing. We may lose market share, we may lose leverage, but at least the rules-based system is going forward on that. But if you have the United States, who's basically the founder of the international security rules-based system itself, saying things like, well, you know, I'm not sure I'm going to come to the defense of certain countries in NATO itself, you have two basic problems here. One is, what are the Putins of the world hearing when you hear that? And taking a look at places like Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania and saying, maybe I'm going to test that. So we could potentially have a major national security crisis. And yes, you can say it's only 3 years, but getting from here to there, that's one of them. You know, there's this piece in the New Yorker about making China great again, in which you have an on-the-record quote from someone saying that Donald Trump would trade Taiwan for jobs. I mean, if the Chinese believe that, are they going to test us in the South China Sea? So we can talk about getting from here to there in the next 3 years. Would not minimize the potential for having something that we really, the Chinese or the Russians, end up testing us on a great power competition. And then there's the longer range question here, which is, what is a world in which countries can't trust relationships, in which the U.S. has been the guarantor since the end of World War II of relationships, of this notion that treaties are really mean treaties, that when people make commitments, commitments are real. If you look at the polling data on NATO, the Italians say they will never die for Germans. But if you look at the polling data for the United States, Americans were always willing to die for Europeans. If this notion that the United States, which has always been the guarantor since the end of World War II, is no longer the reliable partner, that is another rules-based system that is really up for grabs. Can we survive for 3 years and say, oh, it was all a terrible nightmare, JR really wasn't shot? That's a reference for those of you who are our age and watch Dallas. We'll explain that to the students later.
For all the students, your homework is to find out
Who
shot
JR is.
Who was JR and was he
research
shot?
when it was that you couldn't get oranges in January.
Well, there was a
Actually
revival
did
of Dallas, I think, 2 years ago. So I think it's possible there's a Hulu series.
Dynasty is back.
Oh my God. But was it all a terrible nightmare? Or is there something that, you know, we've got two sets of questions. One, are we going to have a terrible national security crisis between now and then, which the system's going to be tested? And the other one, is the system really unraveling? And without the United States as the center of it, there's a fundamental level of anxiety out there.
You know, there's an old adage of pick your predecessor well. You know, I think the next president is going to have a great time because it will be such a breath of fresh air that will be welcomed in capitals around the world.
She will be welcomed.
She will be welcomed by capitals around the world. We should define which pronoun we're going to use. You know, I guess I have mixed views on this. I share Carla's concern that the reputation of the U.S. as a reliable partner has taken a big hit. And even with new leadership, I think people are going to take a somewhat different view of the U.S. going forward than they have in the past. And I think it's important to also recognize that had Trump not won, or when Trump is no longer president, the base of support, the people who share his views and the views that he has sort of amplified, they would continue to exist. And I think that has affected our politics going forward, regardless of who's president. And other countries will look at that as well and say, okay, this strain of isolationism, of America firstism, it may not be articulated quite the same way by a future president, but it's there. It's underneath the surface in a way that needs to be taken seriously. So having said all that, I am hopeful because there's one way of looking at the first year of the Trump administration is that this has been an effort to condition the rest of the world. The rest of the world now understands there's a new sheriff in town, got different perspectives on the world. Assumptions that we all took for granted are now open to question. And the rest of the world is paying attention. And we were talking about it at breakfast. The only thing that other countries resent more than U.S. leadership is U.S. disengagement. And they want the U.S. to be involved. They want to work with the U.S. They want to work with President Trump. They want to find ways of accommodating him if they can. And if this administration were capable of pivoting now from the conditioning exercise that they've been undergoing to laying out a coherent strategy for what the world should look like and how it should be governed and how to address both our national and our transnational challenges, I think the rest of the world will be quite receptive to it. That requires a great deal of thought and flawless execution, neither of which has been the hallmark of this administration to date. But there is, it has only been 1 year, and we have to remember that. And we have to remember that for two reasons. One is we're all talking about 3 years here, and I do think the rest of the world is increasingly of the view we can wait out the United States, whether it's on trade or national security or climate change, if it's 3 years. But as far as I remember, it is possible that it will be longer than 3 years. And I think the question will be, how will the world react in that circumstance to U.S. leadership going forward?
Yeah, this is important. I'm going to keep you on speed dial so that when Carla comes in and depresses me, I'll have an opportunity to have another kind of a conversation.
Although what he just said, he didn't even say the word 8, but he was going there.
Yes, this is true. Seven. I'm just for everybody in the audience. Linda and her team have been out distributing those cards. I have one more question, and then it's going to be your opportunity. So if you haven't had a chance to fill out a question on a card, please do so, and I will be pivoting to those questions in just a moment. I want to go back to the new sheriff in town. There is one, and many would argue that he lives in Beijing. And I wanted to talk a little bit, in a little bit more detail about One Belt, One Road and the nature of Chinese infrastructure investments and trade infrastructure investments specifically. How much ground is Beijing likely to be able to gain over this period of time? And where are the potential missteps? Is there a hand that gets overplayed here plausibly? And I'd like to hear from all three of you on that front if we could.
Well, I think on one hand, China's laid out a very ambitious regional strategic strategy and initiative and has been quite effective at bringing it together and getting the world's attention to it, starting with the AIIB and now the One Belt, One Road initiative. And they have the resources and the commitment to deploy those resources in a way that is obviously not just about economic interaction, but they hope to have political and strategic ramifications as well. Having said that, China has been notoriously bad at exercising soft power and have often overplayed their hands or played it in a ham-handed way to their detriment. And one need only look at Africa, where obviously China is very active, much more active than any of the former colonial powers, much more active than the United States in terms of investment. And the more active they are, the more they are resented by African leaders, African political establishment, and African citizens. And the more they want others there again to balance them. So I think it is great that infrastructure is being built. Hopefully it is of high quality. Some of that's been open to question in some of their investments, particularly in Africa. But I don't think it buys them as much as it could because they do it in a ham-handed way. This Sri Lankan land problem and things of that sort, where they load up countries with debt, the countries can't pay the debt, then they take the land, they create the resentment, they send people on one-way tickets to live there, they use their own workers, they don't employ or train local workers. All of that causes resentment and it may end up making their initiatives less effective than they otherwise would be. But the fact of the matter is we don't have the resources, and the international financial institutions, the World Bank and others, don't necessarily have the resources to build this infrastructure. And if the Chinese are willing to build it, it will hopefully contribute in a positive way to development in these countries and have positive spillover effects. It just may not have all the effects that the Chinese wish it would.
You know, I don't think we fully understand I know we don't fully understand what goes on inside of China in decision making, because it's the power of the PLA, the army, versus the power of the foreign ministry, versus the power of economic forces, and who makes decisions on these things. And there is a competition that we really don't understand. There's a very strong mercantilist force there that's doing things. But when they set up the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which we thought was going to be totally corrupt and mercantilist, and it basically lives by World Bank standards. So somebody made a decision at some point that this wasn't going to be a humiliating exercise, that everybody was watching and that they had to behave. So we don't know what the pressure points are. You made the point before that the best way to work with them is to find constituencies inside. But the real power ministry constituencies are a black box for us.
Yeah.
And so we have China making decisions, national security decisions about Taiwan and how that's going to play out versus their decisions. How much are they looking with One Belt, One Road to make friends versus to try to bully people and pressure people? And I don't think they've made their decisions. And ultimately, those of us who are observers from the outside don't really understand the power of the PLA and the power of it even versus Xi in the sort of decisions that are being made there, and how much of this is just trying to build good neighbor relationships, how much of this is to promote their trade, and how much of this is sheer naked mercantilism.
I think especially with the creation of sort of duplicate institutions that are performing functions that are already done on the global scale, now on the regional scale, China sets itself up to be, it's already a regional it's silly to call it a regional hegemon, but when we're talking about the institutions, they set themselves up to dominate and create a set of rules that they can hopefully project internationally and encourage other nations to work through their institutions, their preferred venues, rather than through the global one. So I see that as a larger threat. I think obviously if China tries to use its power in order to become more of a leader within the existing international institutions, it will certainly face pushback, not necessarily from the United States, but from the international community. But at the moment, I think if they're somewhat unchecked, except for a set of U.S. Tariffs and quotas that are hopefully going to target them. I don't see any way to limit their influence.
I mean, ultimately, you have to ask yourself, do we find it, are they a regional power? I mean, are they, how close are they to being a great power? They have one foreign base in Djibouti. Of course, a few years ago, they had no foreign bases. So do we say, oh my God, they have one foreign base? They've got 2 aircraft carriers, okay? A few years ago, they only had 1 aircraft carrier. The question is, do you focus on the trend as being really terrifying, or when you realize they really are still a regional power?
I don't think China has decided if it wants to be a regional power or not.
Okay. We have a number of questions, some of which walk across China, but we're going to start with NAFTA. This from President Wallerstein, so we get a pride of place in for the first question from the floor. If the NAFTA negotiations blow up or are terminated, what are the immediate and longer term implications? New bilateral agreements, trade wars, something else?
Well, it's been interesting to watch because President Trump has achieved something that neither President Obama nor President Bush nor President Clinton were ever able to do. 71% of Democrats now support NAFTA, which is really quite remarkable. Look, I think what we're learning is people are coming out of the woodwork to support NAFTA who are anti-trade in every other dimension. And I think that's in part a reflection of the fact that people now understand just how integrated the 3 economies are and how disruptive it would be to withdraw from NAFTA, whether it's our agricultural exports, which are highly dependent on, have greatly benefited from access to the other markets, particularly Mexico, or our manufacturing sector, which has remained competitive vis-a-vis China and Southeast Asia, in part because it's been able to integrate across the 3 economies. That's controversial, but I think we probably have more jobs here in manufacturing than we otherwise might if we didn't have the NAFTA integration that occurred over the last 25 years. So I think if it blows up or the U.S. withdraws, we're likely to see a lot of disruption across our economy, agriculture, services, and manufacturing. And it would take some time to reestablish supply chains and a lot of investment in several years to reestablish supply chains to remain, to get that production going again. And the question will be, how competitive will we be internationally if our products are suddenly much more expensive than they otherwise would be. There's talk about whether they could do some bilateral deals or not. I'm not sure that really makes that much sense because Canada and Mexico are part of TPP. Their trading relationship is now established, and they have the TPP framework to govern their relationship. So it's only the question of what our relationship is with the others. And if we're able to, I mean, ironically, I've always thought that after China, our most scratchy trade relationship in the world is with Canada. We think of ourselves as brothers and so close and so, you know, so similar, but actually from a trading perspective, it's been one of the most difficult relationships in our history. Our first tariff, 1789, I believe, was against lumber from Canada. You know, we're still arguing about lumber from Canada today, so plus ça change. So I think hopefully, I think this administration came in relatively indifferent as to whether they wanted a renegotiated NAFTA along the lines that they laid out or withdrawal. I think they've come to learn that withdrawal would be so disruptive that the focus is now on really trying to achieve a renegotiated NAFTA.
Joselyn, Carla, either of you want to get in on this one?
I mean, I agree. The Canadians have been quite clear that they're very unhappy with what's going on with NAFTA, so I don't know what a bilateral agreement would look like, or if it's even possible. I don't see them even entering that negotiation phase.
One of our audience members asks a question about Canada, that Canada and the U.S. are very similar in terms of development. Why do I see so many U.S. branded products labeled Made in Canada? We can get beyond down jackets in that one too.
Look, I think it's just the integration of our production that you know, an automobile will cross the U.S.-Canadian border 4 or 5 times in the process of production. We've just managed to figure out where best to produce things, and because the borders have been open and because tariffs have been eliminated, we've been able to take advantage of the comparative advantage of each country. The steel workers are represented by the same union on both sides of the U.S.-Canadian border. So there's a lot of integration there that would be undone if NAFTA were to actually be withdrawn from.
Okay. Provost Christie has a question about One Belt, One Road, noting that it's focused on areas of the world where the U.S. has relatively limited trade agreements, and asks, have we lost interest in Central Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe?
Have we lost interest? Well, I mean, Central Asia, we've never had much interest in the first place. They're very problematic places, and we've seen them solely in terms of counterterrorism. And that was certainly the Bush administration's focus, George W. Bush administration's focus. And these are very problematic, not democratic places. One could argue that making the sole focus of American foreign policy being counterterrorism was perhaps not the best idea over a long period of time. But these are also places that basically haven't changed since the end of the Soviet Union. So they haven't been the best of allies. The Chinese have a much longer time frame, mainly because they're a country that's been around a lot longer than we do. Africa itself, you know, I think we traditionally have had, I don't think we see it at the Obama administration, had a pretty good idea. They had an Africa command. They did a lot of training in Africa. It depends on different parts of Africa that you're talking about, but I don't think they ceded Africa to the Chinese at all. But the Chinese had a very mercantilist approach to Africa. The U.S., particularly in the Obama administration and in the George W. Bush administration, I think they did a lot in terms of fighting malaria and focusing on AIDS, a lot of development work in Africa, that I think they really raised a very positive profile for the U.S. I think if you were to look at a lot of countries in Africa, the perception of the Chinese and the perception of the U.S., I think the U.S. would win out overwhelmingly on this.
Notwithstanding the disparity in the amount of investment that's gone in. I think that's right.
Two of our audience members would like to know how human rights should factor into trade policy. And of course, this became an issue in TPP, but with trade in China overall.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, one thing we tried to do in TPP, and it goes back before TPP, there's been an evolution of trade policy. NAFTA didn't have any labor rights, for example, any environmental protections in the core of the agreement that were enforceable. That evolved over time, and in TPP we tried to take it further than we ever had before. And so, while human rights, qua human rights, were not dealt with in the trade agreement, we viewed, and Senator Cardin and I used to have extensive conversations about this because he was a real strong proponent of human rights. The labor rights in TPP went further than ever before in terms of the right to organize, the right to strike, the prohibitions on forced labor, prohibitions on child labor, prohibitions on employment discrimination, minimum wage, maximum hours, safe workplace conditions, all fully enforceable. Indeed, if you're going to read this, unfortunately, TPP is 5,300 pages long, but if you're going to read 12 pages, read the Vietnam Labor Consistency Plan. It's all public, it's all on the web. It is a remarkable document of what Vietnam agreed to as a condition of being part of TPP in terms of fundamentally changing workers' rights. And when you add to that the anti-corruption provisions, the regulatory transparency provisions, the free flow of information provisions, I think you've got quite a strong foundation for dealing with human rights more generally. In our view, if you've got an open government that is required to make policies in an open way, where you have a free flow of information across borders, and where you protect workers in particular, which has a good nexus to trade, you are really helping to contribute overall to the human rights environment.
When you say enforceable, who's the enforcer in this?
So the provisions, the labor provisions, are enforceable under exactly the same provisions as the rest of the agreement. Meaning, if Vietnam is not living up to its obligations to allow independent unions to organize and strike, for example, we can bring a case against them.
But we're not a member of the TPP.
Well,
so
the other 11 now,
Yeah.
the other 11 now can do so. But your point is a good one. It's a good reason for us to rejoin. I always said to my friends in labor and in the environmental community, who were critical of TPP at times, without this, we have no tools. With this, we have the tool to go to Vietnam and say, if you're not respecting workers' rights, we are going to cut off your access to the U.S. market. That's the right we had in TPP.
Do you think the Canadians will take that up, or are there members of the 11 who will play that role now?
I would hope that some would. I think it's fair to say people always assumed it would be the U.S. that carried the water on enforcement. It'll be interesting to see. The Japanese have stepped up to lead this initiative in the first place. It'll be interesting to see if other countries step up to lead some of the enforcement efforts. But certainly the mechanisms are there to do so.
So I think one of the missed opportunities is you hear the Trump administration routinely complaining about things being unfair, about China cheating, and even the European allies he's accused now of having some sort of unfair trading practices with the United States. The way to create compliance mechanisms is to be a party to these agreements. And for this reason, it's a bit short-sighted, I think, to sort of decide not to sign these agreements.
Joseline's absolutely right. If you look at the things that President Trump cites as evidence of unfairness, we were talking about York, Pennsylvania earlier, Harley Davidson facing 100% tariffs. Well, those were eliminated in TPP. By not participating in TPP, Harley Davidson will face 100% tariffs, and Kawasaki will face 0% tariffs. How is that fair? Or the labor issues. It's unfair that we have to compete against workers in other countries who get paid a fraction of our workers. Well, that's exactly what TPP was directed at. Not to set a common wage between countries, but to say workers in other countries ought to have the right to organize and to bargain collectively, both because it's a good in and of itself, the dignity of work, and because it's about leveling the playing field between our workers and their workers. So a lot of the complaints, it was interesting to see President Trump in Davos say, oh, gee, maybe we'll go back to TPP and renegotiate a good agreement this time. I'm interested to hear what it is he doesn't like about the current agreement. But a lot of the things he complains about or is concerned about actually were addressed in our other trade agreements. And to Jocelyn's point, if you don't participate, you don't actually get to solve those problems.
Combining a couple of questions and trying to respond to the thread of the conversation here, given the complexity of trade agreements and the additional regulatory structures that they often impose, are there efforts within any of the trade agreements that we've talked about or the bilateral agreements to reduce regulatory hindrances to business activities?
Yes. So the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership really focused on efforts to make regulations simpler for small and medium-sized enterprises. That comprised a lot of the efforts, and by harmonizing regulations, you make it easier. So the financial services industry is one that I focused on in the TTIP, and there would have been areas where it would have been easier for financial services firms, for example, to operate in both places, where you now, both on the side of the European Union and the United States, in many industries have very complex regulatory regimes. Trying to harmonize them on some level would have been an advantage for us. Yeah.
And I would say just on TTIP, to amplify Jocelyn's point, one of the things we were advocating for is not that they had to agree to our regulations, whether it's on food safety or other things that are very sensitive, but simply that they have an open regulatory process. You know, in our country, we publish an agenda of what we're going to regulate, we publish the regulations, we ask for public comment, regulators have to justify what they do and how they dealt with the public comments. That doesn't exist in Brussels in any concerted way. And we were asking for process solutions. Just regulate in an open way. And even that will make it easier for companies and not just companies, but whether you're a consumer group or an environmental group or a labor union or whatever your perspective is, to participate in the process and to produce better regulations. And our faith in the process was that, you know, if you believe in science, if you have a regulatory process that's based on science, you'll end up having fewer barriers between the two markets because science is science. And so let science rule, and we're happy to listen to European scientists as well as American scientists. Let science rule, and some of those obstacles will go away.
Although letting science rule has been something of a controversial position lately. So, a number of questioners are interested in politics and trade, both within the United States and more broadly. So if I can combine a couple of questions. Is the populist trend that we see always and inherently A, going to lead to relatively more isolationist and autarkic regimes? And B, how do you, if that's true, how do you counter that in the context of a U.S. presidential campaign if you want to retract trade as a core value and a commonly perceived good in this country?
Yeah, I think we face a couple challenges of asymmetry here, which is, you know, the benefits of trade, I think, are incontrovertible and broadly shared, but the costs of trade are distinct. They affect some people more than other people, and you know that leads to an intensity issue. You know, when I mentioned earlier that over 70% of the American public now supports trade, that's true, but they don't support it with the fervor that the other 30% oppose it. Right. And when it comes to politics, fervor wins, and that's true, I think, in both parties. It's not necessarily the extremes. It's the people who feel most strongly about it. So it's hard to mobilize people. I think the pendulum does swing, though, and I think that after a period of isolationism and protectionism, I think we're likely to see more receptivity to people saying, you know what, we can't afford to be left on the sidelines. We have to be engaged internationally. We have to show leadership. That may or may not translate into support for any particular trade agreement or trade proposal, but I think the American people are capable and are likely to end up in the position of, you know what, there's too many important things going on in the world for us to be sidelined. And that hopefully that will express itself somehow in the political system. The flip side of that is both parties, you know, in a two-party system, you end up seeing populism pull the parties to polls. In Europe, interestingly, with a multi-party system, I think the center has been able to hold better than here in the United States. And certainly the Democratic Party is being pulled to the left, and the Republican Party is being pulled to the right, and that doesn't bode very well for the kind of centrist, bipartisan international engagement and trade policy that we need.
Yeah, I think Mike is right that I don't think that selling trade as trade, because of the complexity of it, is going to work. You're an expert on political communication, so maybe we should put this to you. I think this question of American leadership, I think Americans generally are proud of being a global leader, proud of the system that we created, winning World War II and the world afterwards, and don't like to be laughed at. And I think that a politician can run on that. I think the embarrassment of Donald Trump is stinging to a lot of people. But I think there is a bigger issue, and I don't think the Democratic Party is doing a very good job of dealing with it right now. And this isn't, whether it is trade or robots, there is this question of the future of work and what is going to happen in a world in which there's chips doing the jobs of human brains. And what is the future of that? And whether we're talking about a guaranteed wage or whatever it's going to be, and this question of a safety net, and what government should do to make sure. What we had before to deal with 50-year-olds whose factories were closed down, which the Trade Adjustment Act, is inadequate. This is a much bigger question for society about the nature of safety nets, the nature of education, the nature of how we adapt to a changing economy. And the economy has changed, and our social policies haven't changed. And we heard one thing from the Democratic Party: we're going to focus on the economy. We're going to focus on why we got beat. And we haven't heard a word since then. They have decided they can sit back and watch Donald Trump make a fool of himself, and they're going to get a benefit of that in the midterms. That may be true, inshallah, but in the reality of it is you can't run a presidential campaign on that. They have to come up with an economic policy that makes sense. They don't have to sell trade policies. They have to sell the future of this country, in which a Trade Adjustment Act is not going to deal with the displacement of innovation. And that's really what it is. They don't have a 21st century economic policy.
So I think to the extent that there's a focus on the American worker and what hurts the American worker, what's good for the American worker, rather than focusing necessarily on protecting certain industries, you could communicate the benefits of a TPP agreement to individual workers, maybe not quantifiably, but it would be a step forward. That would require a political party or someone in a political party to be an advocate for trade, which at the moment I don't think will happen.
I want you to answer the question. You're the expert on political communication.
It's a tough one. I mean, I do think that combining both Carla's and Joselyn's response, that if you can't concretize this in terms of individual lived experience, you're out of luck. It's just not going to happen. The ambassador made the argument earlier that fear trumps statistics, and I think that that's clearly the case. And lots of good research on what people believe and why they believe it in political alignment suggests that you're never going to win arguments based on the weight of evidence. You've got to talk to values, and you've got to talk about people's tribal relationships. So going back to workers and thinking about how you protect communities and jobs, and how you quell fears, moving into some articulate and demonstrable vision of a shared future becomes very important. But this is very complicated with lots of moving parts. And unfortunately, I only have time to ask one more question, so I can't finish answering this one. But we'll have an additional Marxe Issues Forum devoted to this, and recognizing the importance of chips and AI overall. Alexa will be moderating that panel. We'll talk about that very shortly. So I do want to close with one question, bringing this back locally. One of our audience members notes that Governor Cuomo has invited leaders from around the world together to try to stimulate investment in New York and create appetite for New York-based products, not just yogurt, but certainly that. Could we say a little bit about what it is that state and local leadership can be doing right now, given all of what we've noted about the current context, to promote trade activity in their localities?
Well, look, I think a little bit like Carla's answer on the Paris Accord, having more voices out there around the world saying, no, the country has not gone crazy. We do recognize that we live in a global world, that we do need to be engaged. And then selling the benefits of doing business here or doing business with our products here. I think they can be great ambassadors of the United States around the world. And Governor Cuomo's been one of the most effective ones. There are a lot of governors and mayors who are running around the world doing this and doing a very, very good job of it. And at a time when the American brand may be going through some hits for the reasons that Carla mentioned, all the more important to put sort of an alternative effort of branding out there by our governors, by our companies, so that people continue to look to the U.S. for relationships going forward, whether it's 3 years or 7 years down the road.
Yes.
So the European regions have focused on power diplomacy for a while because they had to sort of make their case independently sometimes to the European Commission rather than to their member states. So they offer us one example of how to do this. I think that if we see states set up sort of like regional trade offices represented in other places, and both, domestically as well, to make the case for trade and what it could do for people of the state, you might see more support for trade. But New York does a good job. My home state of Louisiana is on its way to doing a good job, we hope. So, yeah.
I think governors and mayors as alternative voices of political sanity is also a very good thing. And I think they have to take more responsibility because we're certainly not seeing it from the leadership of the political parties in Washington. And if Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan are not going to stand up and say these tax bills are disastrous for education, they're disastrous for health care, I think a lot of the governors understand this, and they're going to have to stand up and tell the truth about what's going on because we're not seeing it from Washington.
Okay. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Froman, Professors Robbins and Muhleisen for a wonderful conversation.